Margaret Flynn lived alone in her small wooden cabin at the edge of the Colorado wilderness, and she had been there for 3 years since her husband Daniel passed away from a sudden heart attack. The cabin was old but sturdy, with thick walls that kept out most of the cold, and a stone fireplace that she kept burning through the long winter nights. She was 62 years old, with gray hair that she kept tied back in a simple bun, and hands that were weathered from years of work, but still steady and strong. Before retiring, she had been a doctor in Denver, but after Daniel died and after their son Peter was killed in the war, she could not bear to stay in the city anymore with all its noise and memories, so she packed her things and moved to this quiet place where the only sounds were wind in the pine trees and occasional wildlife passing through the forest. The winter of 2247 was worse than anyone had predicted, and the storms came one after another without mercy. Tonight's blizzard was the most violent she had seen in all her years here, and the wind screamed like something alive and furious. Snow piled up against the windows in huge drifts, and the cabin shook with each gust that slammed against it. Margaret had prepared well, though, because she always did. She had enough firewood stacked inside to last 2 weeks, and her pantry was full of canned goods and dried foods. The power core that ran her cabin systems was old but reliable, and she had backup batteries charged and ready. She was not worried about surviving the storm because she had survived worse things than weather. She was in her small kitchen making tea when she heard the sound. At first she thought it was just the wind playing tricks, but then it came again. A knocking sound, weak and desperate, barely audible over the howling storm. Margaret set down her teacup and walked to the door where her old hunting rifle leaned against the wall. She picked it up out of habit because living alone in the wilderness meant being careful, and then she pulled open the heavy wooden door. The blast of freezing air hit her like a physical force, and snow swirled into her cabin. Standing on her porch were figures that made her freeze in place. 20 of them huddled together, covered in ice and snow. Their environmental suits were torn and sparking with electricity dyeing systems. Through the cracked visors of their helmets, she could see faces that were not human. The faces had angular features with high cheekbones and large dark eyes and skin that had a copper tone to it. These were Apaches, the alien species that humanity had been fighting for 10 years in a brutal war that spanned multiple star systems. The one at the front of the group suddenly collapsed forward, and Margaret dropped her rifle without thinking. She caught him before he hit the wooden planks of her porch, and the weight of him nearly took her down too, but she managed to stay upright. His suit was hissing and leaking precious heat, and when she looked at the temperature gauge on his chest panel, she saw it was critically low. Ice had formed on the inside of his helmet, and his breath came in short gasps. The others behind him were in similar condition or worse. They must have crashed nearby, she thought, and their ship was probably scattered across the mountainside in pieces, torn apart by the storm's fury. Margaret looked at these 20 alien soldiers on her doorstep, and her mind filled with memories. She remembered Peter, her beautiful boy with his bright smile and quick laugh. She remembered the day the military officers came to her door 3 years ago to tell her that he had died at the Battle of Titan, killed by Apache weapons. She remembered the funeral and the folded flag they gave her, and the hollow, empty feeling that had lived in her chest ever since. These creatures in front of her were the enemy. They were the ones who had taken her son from her. They were the reason she wore black for a year and still sometimes woke up crying in the night. But they were also dying right in front of her, and she was a doctor. Before she was a mother or a widow or a grieving woman, she had taken an oath to do no harm and to preserve life wherever she found it. These were living beings, and they were freezing to death on her porch, and she had the power to save them or let them die. It would be so easy to close the door and go back to her tea and let the storm take them. No one would ever know, and no one would blame her if they did. But she would know, and she would have to live with that choice for whatever years she had left. Margaret made her decision in the space of a heartbeat. She hauled the collapsed Apache soldier up and started dragging him inside. Her back protested and her arms burned, but she got him through the door and onto her living room floor. Then she looked at the others who stood there shivering and dying in the storm, and she raised her voice over the wind. "Get inside," she shouted, even though she knew they probably could not understand English. "All of you right now, move." They understood her tone, if not her words, and they stumbled forward into the cabin one by one. Margaret counted them as they came through the door. 20 total, including the one she had dragged inside. 20 alien soldiers who should have been her enemies filling up her small home. She pushed the door closed against the wind and threw the bolt, and suddenly the cabin was full of bodies, and the sound of failing equipment and labored breathing. She looked at them all clustered together, trying to share what little heat their dying suit still produced, and she rolled up her sleeves. "All right then," she said to herself. "Let us get to work." Getting 20 alien soldiers into her small cabin and arranging them so they would not freeze was like trying to solve an impossible puzzle. Margaret moved fast because she knew from her medical training that they did not have much time. She grabbed her furniture and shoved it against the walls to clear space. Her old couch went against one wall and her reading chair went into the corner. She pulled her coffee table into the kitchen and pushed her bookshelf next to the door. With the main room cleared, she went to her bedroom and stripped the bed, pulling off blankets and sheets. She emptied her linen closet, taking every spare blanket and pillow and sleeping bag she owned. She brought out the thick quilts her mother had made years ago, and the wool blankets Daniel had used when he went camping. She laid everything out on the floor, creating a large padded area where the Apaches could lie down together. The Apaches watched her work with those large dark eyes, and she could not tell what they were thinking. Their suits were making terrible noises now, hissing and popping and sparking. Without the environmental controls working, they would all be dead within an hour. Margaret knew their biology well enough because the military had made sure every civilian in the frontier territories learned about Apache physiology. The training videos had called it knowing your enemy, but the information had been thorough. Apaches needed temperatures around 75 degrees to survive comfortably. They could tolerate cold better than heat, but prolonged exposure to freezing temperatures would shut down their organs just like it would for humans. Their blood was copper-based instead of iron-based, which gave it that blue-green color, and their hearts had 3 chambers instead of 4. They breathed oxygen just like humans did, but they needed slightly more of it. Right now, these 20 soldiers were suffering from severe hypothermia, and if she did not warm them up fast, they would slip into shock and die. She ran to her fireplace and opened the flue wide. She grabbed logs from the stack beside the hearth and threw them in. She crumpled newspaper and added kindling and lit it all with her long matches. The fire caught quickly and she kept adding wood until flames roared up the chimney. Heat began to pour into the room, but it was not enough. She went to her storage closet and pulled out every portable heater she owned, 4 of them in total. She set them up around the room, pointing them at the cluster of Apaches on the floor. She plugged them all in and turned them to maximum. Her cabin's power core made a groaning sound under the sudden load, but it held steady. The lights dimmed slightly but stayed on. Next, she went to the kitchen and filled her largest pot with water. She set it on the stove to boil, and while she waited, she opened cabinets, pulling out everything she could use. Cans of soup and packages of dried noodles and vegetables she had stored for winter. She needed to make something warm that they could eat, something that would heat them from the inside. She emptied 3 cans of chicken soup into another pot and set it to simmer. She found a package of beef broth and added that too. She threw in some rice and carrots and let it all cook together into a thick, warm mixture. While the food heated, she went back to the Apaches and knelt beside them. The one who had collapsed first, the one she had caught, seemed to be their leader. He was watching her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable, but she ignored it and focused on her work. She had a medical scanner in her supply kit and she pulled it out now. The device was designed for humans, but it could read basic vital signs for most species. She ran it over the leader first and frowned at the readings. His core temperature was dangerously low at 58 degrees. His heart rate was slow and erratic. His breathing was shallow, critical condition. She moved through the group, checking each one and making mental notes. 2 others were as bad as the leader. The rest were in slightly better shape, but not by much. She went to her bathroom and grabbed every thermal blanket she had. These were special emergency blankets made of material that reflected body heat back, and she wrapped the 3 critical cases in them carefully. She dragged them closer to the fireplace where the heat was strongest. The others she helped remove their damaged helmets, because the suits were dead now anyway, and the helmets were just trapping cold air against their faces. The Apaches underneath. The suits looked more vulnerable than she expected. Their faces were narrow with delicate bone structure. Their eyes were huge and expressive. Their skin was smooth, and in the firelight it had an almost metallic sheen. They had no hair on their heads, but they had what looked like ridges running from their foreheads down the backs of their necks. Some of them were young, so young they might have been teenagers by human standards. They looked scared and cold and grateful. The soup was ready, so Margaret ladled it into every cup and bowl she owned. She showed them how to hold the cups and how to sip carefully. The heat of the liquid made them flinch at first, but then they drank eagerly. Some of them made soft clicking sounds that might have been their version of saying thank you. She refilled cups and handed out more blankets and adjusted the heaters to direct warmth where it was needed most. The storm outside grew worse. Wind hammered the cabin walls and snow piled higher against the windows. Margaret kept working. She checked temperatures every 30 minutes. She redistributed blankets when some Apaches warmed up faster than others. She made more soup and more tea and more warm drinks. She added wood to the fire again and again, keeping the flames high and hot. Her back ached and her eyes burned with exhaustion, but she did not stop. Around midnight, one of the critical cases finally stabilized. His temperature climbed above 60 degrees and his breathing evened out. Margaret felt a surge of relief so strong it made her hands shake. Around 3 in the morning, the second critical case opened his eyes and looked at her. She smiled at him and he made a soft clicking sound. By the time dawn started to gray the windows, all 20 Apaches were sitting up. They were alive. They were going to survive. And they were all watching her with expressions that looked like wonder. The storm broke just before sunrise, and Margaret stood at her window watching the world transform from black to gray to pale gold as light crept across the snow-covered landscape. The wind had finally died down to nothing, and the only sound was the occasional creak of ice settling on tree branches. She was exhausted in a way that went deep into her bones, but she felt oddly peaceful. Behind her, the 20 Apaches sat quietly on the floor, wrapped in her blankets and arranged in small groups. They spoke to each other in their own language, which sounded like musical clicking mixed with soft whistles. It was actually quite beautiful, she thought. She had used her emergency radio an hour ago to contact the nearest human military outpost. It was a small base called Fort Harrison, about 30 miles south through difficult mountain terrain. The officer who answered had been shocked to hear from her because civilians rarely used emergency channels. When she explained the situation, there had been a long silence on the other end. Then the officer, whose name was Lieutenant Phillips, had told her to stay calm and stay inside and wait for extraction. He said a patrol would reach her by midday. He did not say what would happen to the Apaches when the patrol arrived, but Margaret could guess. They would be taken as prisoners of war. They would be interrogated and held in detention facilities. Some might be exchanged for human prisoners eventually. Others might spend years locked up. And Margaret herself might face serious trouble for helping them. Aiding enemy combatants during wartime was technically treason, even if she had just been trying to keep them from freezing to death. She sighed and rubbed her eyes. She was too tired to worry about it now. Whatever consequences came, she would face them. She had made her choice, and she would not take it back even if she could. These soldiers were alive because of her, and that mattered more than politics or military regulations. The leader of the group stood up and walked over to her. He moved carefully, like he was trying not to startle her. Up close, he was quite tall, at least 6.5 feet, and his frame was lean but clearly strong. His copper-colored skin had warmed back to what she assumed was its normal shade, and his dark eyes watched her with an intelligence that was impossible to miss. He reached into a pouch on his belt and pulled out a small device no bigger than a coin. He held it out to her. Margaret took it carefully. The device was smooth and warm in her palm. Suddenly it projected a hologram into the air between them. Symbols appeared first, strange flowing characters that she could not read. Then the symbols flickered and changed, and English words formed in glowing letters. "I am called Flying Hawk in your language," the words said. Margaret looked up at him in surprise. "You speak English?" she asked. The hologram changed again. "No, but this device translates. It learns quickly. I wanted to thank you. You saved us. We are in your debt." Margaret shook her head. "You do not owe me anything. I did what any decent person would do." The hologram flickered, and she could almost feel Flying Hawk choosing his words carefully. "No," he made the device say, "not any person. We have fought your people for 10 cycles of seasons. We know humans. We know how they see us. Many would have let us die. Some would have killed us themselves while we were helpless. You did neither. You brought us into your home. You gave us warmth and medicine and food. You gave us our lives back." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "My son died at Titan," she said quietly. "Did you know that? I lost him to your people's weapons 3 years ago." Flying Hawk's expression changed, and even though his face was alien, she could recognize sorrow there. The hologram displayed new words. "I lost my sister at Titan. She was a combat pilot. Her ship was destroyed in the battle. Perhaps our families took each other from us. The two of them stood there in the growing morning light and looked at each other. Human and Apache, enemy species who had been killing each other for a decade, and yet here they were standing in her cabin connected by loss and by the simple act of one choosing to save the other. "But you still saved us," Flying Hawk made the device say, "even knowing what you knew. Even carrying that pain, you chose our lives over your hatred. That is what we will remember." Before Margaret could respond, she heard something new. A low humming sound that came from outside and grew steadily louder. She turned back to the window and her breath caught in her chest. Ships were descending through the morning sky. Not human ships. Apache ships. Dozens of them at first and then more and more until the sky was filled with them. They were elegant vessels with swept-back wings and hulls that gleamed in the sunrise. They settled into the snowy meadow around her cabin like a flock of enormous birds landing. Margaret counted 20 ships, then 50, then stopped counting because there were too many. "Oh no," she whispered. "Oh no, they are going to think I called them here. They are going to think I am working with you." Flying Hawk stood beside her at the window. The hologram spoke his words. "Do not fear. They come because I called them." "You called them," she said, turning to stare at him. "When? How?" "This morning when the storm cleared. My suit still had enough power for one short-range transmission. I told them what happened. I told them about the human widow who chose mercy over vengeance." "But why would you bring a whole fleet here?" Margaret asked. "You are putting me in terrible danger." Flying Hawk looked at her and the hologram said simply, "Because what you did is important. Because my people need to see that humans can be more than killers. Because you have changed everything whether you know it or not." The cabin door opened without any warning or knock and Margaret spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. More Apaches entered, and these ones wore pristine armor instead of damaged environmental suits. Their weapons were holstered at their sides, but their presence filled her small home with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. There were 10 of them, and they moved with military precision, arranging themselves in formation. The leader of this new group was female, and Margaret could tell by subtle differences in facial structure and body shape. She was older than Flying Hawk, with visible scars on her neck and arms. Her armor was decorated with markings that probably indicated rank. When she spoke, every Apache in the room stood straighter, including Flying Hawk. Her voice was deep and resonant and carried authority. Flying Hawk's translation device flickered with new words. "This is Commander Swift River. She leads our northern fleet. She has come to see you." Commander Swift River studied Margaret with eyes that seemed to look right through her and see everything she had ever done or thought or felt. The Apache commander was imposing in a way that had nothing to do with size or weapons, and everything to do with presence. She carried herself like someone who had led others through impossible situations and brought them out alive. Her scarred hands rested calmly at her sides, but Margaret had no doubt those hands could move with lethal speed if needed. The cabin felt too small suddenly with all these warriors packed inside it. Then Swift River did something that Margaret never expected in 1,000 years. She knelt. She went down on one knee right there on the worn wooden floor of the cabin and bowed her head. And every single Apache in the room did the same. All 20 of the soldiers Margaret had saved and all 10 of the newcomers in their pristine armor. They knelt in perfect silence. "What are you doing?" Margaret asked, because she did not understand, and it frightened her a little to see these powerful beings making themselves vulnerable like this. Flying Hawk remained, kneeling, but he held up his translation device. Showing respect, the words said, "Among our people there is no greater honor than to spare an enemy's life, when you have no obligation to do so. You could have closed your door. You could have called your authorities first and waited for instructions. You could have done nothing and let the storm take us. Any of those choices would have been understandable. Instead, you fought for our lives as if we were your own kin." Swift River spoke, and her voice filled the cabin with its depth. Flying Hawk translated as she went. "Margaret Flynn, widow of the human called Daniel Flynn and mother of the fallen warrior called Peter Flynn. You have shown us something we thought did not exist in your species anymore. You have shown us that humans can understand the sacred nature of life itself. You have shown us that mercy still lives in human hearts." "Please stand up," Margaret said, because watching them all kneel was making her deeply uncomfortable. "Please, I do not want this. I just wanted to help people who were dying." "That is exactly why we kneel." Swift River's words came through the device. "You did not help us for reward or recognition. You did not help us because someone ordered you to. You helped us because your spirit would not allow you to do otherwise. That is the rarest and most valuable thing in all the universe. Swift River rose smoothly to her feet, and the others followed. She gestured toward the window, toward the hundreds of ships that now surrounded the cabin in the meadow, and on the hillsides and in every clear space for miles around. Margaret looked out and realized there were even more ships than before. The sky was full of them, circling slowly like hawks riding thermals. When Flying Hawk sent his message, it went through our fleet communication network, Swift River explained through the translation. Every ship within 2 days' travel received it. They all came. They came to witness what you did. They came to honor you. They came to offer the debt of life. Margaret shook her head, feeling overwhelmed and small. I do not understand any of this. I do not want anything from you. I just wanted those 20 soldiers to live through the night. That is precisely why we offer it, Flying Hawk said, and his translator carried a tone that might have been gentle. The debt of life is our oldest tradition. It goes back thousands of years to before we had ships or cities. When one being saves another without any expectation of reward and without any requirement of honor or kinship, but purely from the goodness of their spirit, then that being becomes sacred, protected, honored by all who know of the deed. Swift River approached Margaret and moved slowly, like she was approaching a nervous animal. She reached into her armor with careful, deliberate movements and withdrew something. It was a crystal pendant on a silver chain. The crystal glowed with an inner light that pulsed gently like a heartbeat. It was beautiful and strange, and Margaret could not stop staring at it. This is the mark of the saved Flying Hawk, translated. As Swift River held the pendant out with both hands in a gesture that was clearly ceremonial, it means that you are under the protection of all Apache people everywhere. Any who harm you answer to all of us. Any who threaten you face our entire species. Any who need you will come to your aid. You are marked as sacred now and forever. I cannot accept this, Margaret protested, even as Swift River gently placed the chain around her neck. The crystal settled against her chest and felt warm through her shirt. I'm just one old woman. I did one small thing on one night. This is too much. No, Flying Hawk said, and this time she heard his actual voice coming through underneath the translation. He was learning English, she realized, and working hard at it. His accent was thick and the sounds came awkwardly from his throat, but the words were clear. You did the thing that ends wars. You reminded us that we are not so different, that mercy exists on both sides, that even enemies can choose to see each other as people instead of targets. That is not a small thing. That is everything. Outside, the assembled ships began to hum in unison. The sound was deep and resonant, and it vibrated in Margaret's chest like a second heartbeat. It was beautiful in a way that made her eyes sting with tears. The hum rose and fell in patterns that felt almost like music or like breathing. It filled the air and seemed to come from the ground and the sky at once. What is that sound? Margaret asked in a whisper. They sing, Flying Hawk said, and now his voice carried something like awe. They sing the song of life renewed. It is very old. We sing it when someone is saved from certain death. When life is given back where it should have been lost. They sing it for us. For what you did. For what might be possible now. Tears ran down Margaret's face, though she could not say exactly why. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was the weight of everything that had happened. Maybe it was grief for her son finally finding a place to go. Maybe it was hope, which she had not felt in 3 years. She stood there in her small cabin, surrounded by alien warriors, who should have been her enemies, and listened to 1,000 ships sing, I do not know what to do now, she admitted quietly. You do not have to do anything, Swift, River said through the translation. You have already done what needed doing. Now we will see what comes from it. The human military patrol arrived exactly at noon, just as Lieutenant Phillips had promised. Margaret watched from her doorway as 3 transport ships came in fast and hard with their engines roaring and weapon systems clearly active. They landed at the very edge of the massive Apache fleet and looked absurdly small compared to the alien vessels that surrounded them on all sides. The transport ramps dropped and soldiers poured out in full combat armor with rifles up and ready. Commander Kate Morrison was the first one down the ramp, and Margaret recognized her immediately. Kate had been to the cabin twice before on routine frontier patrols, and they had shared coffee and conversation. She was a good officer, tough but fair, with a sharp mind and genuine concern for the civilians under her protection. Right now her face was set in an expression of grim determination, and Margaret could see the tension in every line of her body. She had 24 soldiers with her, and every single one of them looked terrified despite their training. They were vastly outnumbered and everyone knew it. Margaret Flynn Kate called out, keeping her rifle pointed at the ground, but ready to raise it in an instant. "Step away from the hostiles, please. We are here to extract you and secure the area." Margaret walked down from her porch and stood in the snow between the two forces. "Nobody is extracting anybody," she called back firmly. "Stand down, Commander. These people are under my protection." Kate's expression would have been funny if the situation were not so dangerous. "Ma'am," she said with strained patience, "with all due respect, you are surrounded by approximately 1,000 enemy combatants. We have orders to secure this location and remove you to safety. Please cooperate. I am perfectly safe," Margaret said. "These soldiers came to my cabin during the storm and I gave them shelter. They are grateful, not hostile. Now put your weapons down before someone makes a mistake we will all regret." Swift River emerged from the cabin at that moment, and immediately every human weapon swung toward her. 20 rifles aimed at her center mass. The Apache commander did not flinch. She raised her hands slowly, showing they were empty of weapons. She spoke in her deep voice, and Flying Hawk came out behind her with his translation device active. "Commander Morrison of the Human Military Forces," the translation said. "I am Commander Swift River of the Apache Northern Fleet. We come in peace. We come to honor the human called Margaret Flynn, who saved 20 of our people from certain death during the storm. We mean no harm to any human here." Kate kept her rifle raised, though Margaret could see her finger was off the trigger at least. "You expect me to believe that an entire Apache fleet came here just out of gratitude?" she asked with obvious skepticism. "Yes," Swift River said through the translation, "because it is the truth. We have no weapons armed. We have made no hostile movements. We are here only to give honor where honor is due." Margaret walked forward until she stood directly in front of Kate's rifle. The commander immediately lowered it with a curse. Margaret held up the crystal pendant that hung around her neck. "Kate, look at this," she said. "They gave me their highest honor. They have declared me sacred and under their protection. This is real. They mean what they say." Kate stared at the glowing crystal, and Margaret saw understanding start to dawn in her eyes. "Ma'am," she said slowly, "do you understand what you have done? Aiding enemy forces during wartime is treason. You could face prison time or worse, than I will face it." Margaret said tiredly. "I am done caring about politics and regulations, Kate. I saved lives last night. 20 beings who would have frozen to death if I had closed my door. If that makes me a traitor, then I guess I am a traitor. But I will not apologize for it, and I will not regret it." Kate finally lowered her rifle completely and signaled for her soldiers to do the same. They obeyed but kept their weapons ready just in case. "Ma'am," Kate said, "I need to report this situation up the chain of command. You understand that, right?" "This is way above my authority level." "I understand," Margaret said. "Do what you need to do. I will be here waiting." Kate pulled out her communication unit and stepped away to make the call. Margaret could hear her speaking rapidly to someone on the other end, explaining the situation. The words impossible and unprecedented came through clearly. Margaret looked back at Swift River and Flying Hawk, who stood calmly on her porch watching everything. The other Apaches had emerged from the cabin as well, and they stood in a loose group looking at the human soldiers with curiosity rather than hostility. The two groups studied each other across the snow, and Margaret stood between them, feeling like a bridge, connecting two worlds that had been separate for too long. Kate came back after several minutes, and her expression was unreadable. "They are sending Ambassador Henry Cole," she said. "He was already in the sector for other negotiations. He will be here in 3 hours. Until then, we are ordered to maintain position and keep the peace. Ma'am, I am supposed to take you into protective custody, but I am going to use my discretion and let you stay here. Do not make me regret that decision." "I will not," Margaret promised. "Thank you, Kate." The soldiers set up a perimeter, and the Apaches remained near the cabin, and everyone waited. More human ships arrived as word spread. News drones appeared in the sky, broadcasting the scene to billions of people across human space. Margaret saw reporters setting up equipment at the edge of the meadow. This was going to be everywhere within hours. Her quiet, anonymous life was over. She had become something she never wanted to be. A symbol, a story, a turning point. She went back into her cabin and made sandwiches because she did not know what else to do. Flying Hawk followed her inside. "You are in trouble because of us," he said in his halting English. Maybe, Margaret admitted as she spread peanut butter on bread. "But it is the right kind of trouble. The kind that means something." "I am sorry," he said. "Do not be," she told him. I made my choice with open eyes. I would make it again. Now help me carry these sandwiches outside. If we are all going to stand around waiting, we might as well not be hungry. Ambassador Henry Cole arrived in a sleek diplomatic vessel that landed with barely a whisper between the human and Apache positions. He was a man in his middle 60s with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. Margaret had seen him on news broadcasts before because he was famous for trying to negotiate peace with the Apaches for years without success. He had a reputation for being brilliant and stubborn in equal measure. He climbed out of his ship wearing a simple suit rather than military uniform and walked across the snow like he owned the ground beneath his feet. He shook hands with Commander Morrison first and spoke to her quietly for a few minutes. Then he approached Swift River and stopped at a respectful distance. He placed his hand over his heart in a gesture Margaret recognized from her cultural training as an Apache sign of peaceful greeting. Swift River returned the gesture with visible surprise. Commander Swift River Henry said with his translation device active, "I am Ambassador Cole. I have been trying to speak with someone of your authority for 3 years. I did not expect it to happen like this. Nor did I expect to be standing on human soil surrounded by your military," Swift River replied. "Yet here we are. Life brings strange meetings." Henry turned to Margaret and his expression softened. "Mrs. Flynn," he said, "you have created quite a situation." "I saved some people from freezing," Margaret said simply. "That is all I did." "That is never all it is," Henry replied. "But come, let us go inside and talk. I think we have much to discuss." They gathered in Margaret's cabin, which was now far too crowded for comfort. Henry sat in her reading chair. Swift River and Flying Hawk stood near the fireplace. Commander Morrison stood by the door with her hand near her sidearm. Margaret made tea because it gave her something to do with her hands. When everyone had a cup, Henry leaned back and looked at each person in turn. "Tell me everything," he said. "From the beginning." So they did. Flying Hawk explained how their ship had been damaged by the storm and crashed in the mountains. How they had tried to reach an emergency beacon, but the storm was too strong. How they had seen the light from Margaret's cabin and stumbled toward it, knowing they would die if they did not find shelter. Margaret explained how she had found them on her porch and made the decision to help them despite everything. Swift River explained the tradition of the dead of life and why the fleet had come. Commander Morrison added her perspective from the military side. When they finished, Henry was quiet for a long moment. He sipped his tea and stared into the fire. Finally, he spoke. "This is unprecedented," he said. "In 10 years of war, nothing like this has happened. We have had prisoner exchanges and brief ceasefires for humanitarian reasons, but nothing like this. Nothing that touches the heart of why we fight. That is because humans and Apaches keep killing each other before anyone can do anything else," Margaret said bluntly. "I broke the cycle, Ambassador. Just for one night. Just for 20 people. But I broke it. I proved it can be broken." Flying Hawk spoke up using his own English now rather than the translator. "Ambassador Cole, we know your name. We know you have tried to make peace. Our leaders refused every time because we did not believe humans could see us as equals. We thought you viewed us as animals to be destroyed, as threats to be eliminated. We could not imagine that humans would choose mercy over revenge. And we thought the same of you," Henry said quietly. "We thought you were monsters who enjoyed killing, who had no honor or compassion. We were both wrong." "Yes," Swift River said. "But Margaret Flynn proved how wrong we were. She had every reason to hate us. We killed her son. She knew what we had done to human worlds. Yet she saved our soldiers anyway. She chose their lives over her grief. If one human can do this, then perhaps our entire understanding of your species is flawed. Perhaps there is hope for peace." Henry looked at Swift River with an intensity that made the air feel electric. "Commander Swift River, do you have the authority to negotiate on behalf of your people?" "I have authority from the Apache High Council to negotiate if I believe there is genuine possibility of peace," Swift River said. "We have been waiting for a sign that peace was possible, that humans could see us as something other than enemies. Margaret Flynn is that sign." Henry turned to Margaret and his expression was both hopeful and concerned. "Mrs. Flynn, are you willing to be that sign? To stand as proof that our two species can coexist? This will not be easy for you. There will be people on both sides who hate what you did, who want to see you punished. Are you prepared for that?" Margaret thought about her son Peter and how proud he had been when he enlisted. She thought about Daniel and the life they had built together. She thought about all the years of grief and anger and emptiness. Then she thought about 20 young Apache soldiers huddled in her cabin, afraid and cold, and so terribly human in their vulnerability. "I am willing," she said. "But I have one condition." "Name it," Henry and Swift River said at almost the same moment. "We start by ending the fighting in this sector immediately," Margaret said. "No more killing while we talk. If we are serious about peace, then we prove it by stopping the war, even if it is just for a little while. Even if it is just in this one part of space. We stop shooting and start talking." Henry looked at Swift River. The Apache commander looked back at him. The moment stretched out until Margaret thought her nerves would snap from the tension. "I can order a ceasefire in the northern sector," Swift River finally said. "All Apache ships under my command will stand down immediately. But I need the same from you, Ambassador." "I cannot order the military," Henry said. "But I can strongly recommend it to the Joint Chiefs and they will listen. Commander Morrison, can you get me a secure line to Earth Command right now?" "Yes, sir," Kate said, and immediately started working on her communication equipment. They spent the next 3 hours in intense discussion. Henry spoke with military leaders and government officials on Earth. Swift River spoke with the Apache High Council through her ship's communication systems. Maps were pulled up showing the northern sector, which encompassed about 40 star systems. Boundaries were drawn. Terms were proposed and negotiated and refined. Margaret sat quietly through most of it, feeling overwhelmed by what she had started. Finally, as the sun began to set, Henry and Swift River stood facing each other in the center of the cabin. They both looked exhausted but also energized. "It is done," Henry said. "Effective immediately, all human military forces in the northern sector are ordered to stand down. No offensive operations, no hostile actions unless fired upon first. This ceasefire will hold for 90 days while we negotiate. All Apache forces in the northern sector will do the same," Swift River said. 90 days. No attacks, no raids. We will see if peace is possible." They shook hands and Margaret started crying. She could not help it. The tears came and would not stop. Flying Hawk put his hand on her shoulder in a gesture of comfort. Kate Morrison wiped at her own eyes. Even Henry looked emotional. "The war is not over," Margaret said through her tears. "This is just one sector. There is still so much fighting. Every peace starts small," Henry said gently. "This is how it begins. With one person making one choice. With enemies willing to see each other as people. You did that, Margaret. You started something today that might save millions of lives." Outside the cabin, the assembled ships, both human and Apache, began to hum together. The sound was different from before. It was harmonious. 2 species singing in unison for the first time in 10 years. Margaret stood at her window and watched the sun set over a meadow full of ships that were no longer pointing weapons at each other, and she allowed herself to hope. The next 3 months transformed Margaret's life in ways she could never have imagined. Her small cabin became the unofficial center of peace negotiations, and she found herself hosting meetings between human and Apache representatives almost every day. The meadow that had once been quiet and empty was now home to a temporary settlement of prefabricated buildings where diplomats and military officers from both sides worked on the details of a lasting peace treaty. The media attention was overwhelming at first. News crews from every major human network wanted to interview her. She was called a hero and a traitor depending on who was speaking. Some humans celebrated what she had done and held rallies in her honor. Others protested and demanded she be arrested for treason. The Apache reactions were similarly mixed. Some saw her as a bridge to peace, while others saw her kindness as a trick or weakness to exploit. Margaret tried to ignore it all and focus on what mattered, which was the actual work of building understanding between 2 species that had been killing each other for a decade. Flying Hawk became her constant companion and translator. His English improved rapidly, and he proved to be naturally gifted at languages. He moved into one of the temporary buildings nearby, but spent most of his time at her cabin helping her navigate the complicated world of interspecies diplomacy. The other 19 soldiers she had saved remained in the area as well, and they became something like guards for her, though she insisted she did not need protection. They came to her cabin in shifts, bringing gifts from their families and teaching her words in their language. She learned that the clicking sounds could express dozens of different emotions, depending on pitch and rhythm. She learned their names and their stories and found herself caring about them deeply. Ambassador Henry Cole set up his headquarters in the largest of the temporary buildings, and worked tirelessly on the negotiations. The initial ceasefire held despite several tense moments when ships from both sides came close to firing on each other. Henry established protocols for communication and created neutral zones where representatives could meet safely. He brought in experts on Apache culture and human psychology. He organized exchanges where small groups from each species could interact under controlled conditions. Progress was slow and frustrating, but it was progress. Commander Swift River remained as well commanding the Apache fleet from her flagship, which stayed in orbit above the meadow. She met with Henry regularly, and the two of them developed a working relationship built on mutual respect, if not quite friendship. She also visited Margaret often, and they would sit together drinking tea and talking through Flying Hawk's translations. Margaret learned that Swift River had 3 children, all grown and serving in the Apache military. She learned that Swift River had lost her partner in the war 5 years ago. They shared their grief and found comfort in knowing that pain was universal regardless of species. One afternoon, about 6 weeks into the ceasefire, Margaret was working in her garden behind the cabin when she heard shouting from the settlement. She hurried around the building and saw a crowd gathering. Human and Apache soldiers were facing each other with weapons drawn. Her heart sank. This was how it would end, she thought. One mistake, one moment of fear or anger, everything would collapse. She ran toward the crowd, pushing through until she reached the center. A young human soldier named Chris Palmer was pointing his rifle at an Apache soldier named Bright Star. Both of them looked terrified and furious. "What is happening, Margaret?" demanded. "He stole from me," Chris shouted. "I had a pendant my sister gave me before she died, and he took it." "I did not steal," Bright Star said through his translator device. "I found it on the ground. I was going to return it." "You are a liar," Chris yelled. "You people are all liars." The situation was seconds away from violence. Margaret could feel it. She stepped between the two soldiers, putting herself directly in the line of fire. "Stop," she said firmly. "Both of you lower your weapons right now." "Ma'am, get out of the way," Chris said. "This does not concern you." "Everything here concerns me," Margaret said. "I am the reason you are all here. I am the reason we have this chance at peace, and I will not let you destroy it over a misunderstanding. Now lower your weapons or I will be very disappointed in both of you." The absurdity of being scolded like children by a grandmother seemed to break the tension. Chris slowly lowered his rifle. Bright Star holstered his sidearm. Margaret held out her hand to Bright Star, who pulled the pendant from his pouch and gave it to her. She examined it closely. It was a simple thing, a silver chain with a small star charm. "Bright Star says he found this on the ground near the mess hall," Margaret said. "Chris, did you lose it there?" "I might have," Chris admitted reluctantly. "I remember having it at breakfast, but not after." "So he was telling the truth," Margaret said. "He found your precious belonging and was trying to return it, and you responded by pointing a weapon at him and calling him a liar. Does that seem like a fair response?" Chris looked ashamed. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. Margaret handed him the pendant. "Bright Star," she said. "Chris Palmer owes you an apology." "I am sorry, Bright Star," Chris said stiffly. "I was wrong. I should not have accused you." Bright Star clicked softly and his translator said, "Apology accepted. I understand. You have lost much to my people. Trust is difficult." Margaret looked around at the crowd of humans and Apaches watching. "This is what we are fighting against," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Not each other, but our own fear and assumptions. Peace is hard work. It requires us to give each other the benefit of the doubt. It requires us to see each other as individuals, not as representatives of our entire species. If we cannot do that, then all of this is pointless." The crowd slowly dispersed. Chris and Bright Star stood awkwardly for a moment, then Bright Star extended his 3-fingered hand. Chris shook it carefully. It was a small moment, but Margaret knew it mattered. These tiny bridges between individuals were what would hold the peace together. That evening, Henry came to her cabin looking excited. "Margaret, we have a breakthrough," he said. "Both governments have agreed in principle to a full peace treaty. We still have details to work out, but the framework is there. A formal end to hostilities. Established borders, trade agreements, cultural exchange programs, everything we have been working toward." Margaret felt relief wash over her. "That is wonderful," she said. "When will it be signed?" "We are planning a ceremony 6 weeks from now," Henry said. "We want to hold it here at your cabin if you will allow it. We want you there as the guest of honor. You started this, Margaret. You should be there to see it finished." She agreed, though the thought of being at the center of such attention made her anxious. The next 6 weeks were a flurry of preparations. Dignitaries from dozens of human worlds made plans to attend. Apache leaders from every major colony confirmed they would come. Security forces from both sides coordinated to keep everyone safe. Margaret's quiet meadow was transformed into an elaborate venue with stages and seating and technology for broadcasting the event across known space. Through it all, Margaret kept working on the small things. She hosted dinners where humans and Apaches ate together and learned each other's customs. She organized sports competitions where mixed teams competed in games from both cultures. She taught Apache soldiers how to make human food and learned how to prepare Apache meals in return. Flying Hawk helped her with all of it, and somewhere along the way they became true friends bound by shared purpose and genuine affection. The night before the signing ceremony, Margaret could not sleep. She sat on her porch wrapped in a blanket watching the stars. Flying Hawk found her there and sat down beside her. "Are you nervous?" he asked in his much-improved English. "Terrified," she admitted. "What if it does not work? What if people cannot let go of the hatred?" "Then we try again," Flying Hawk said. "And again. And again. Until it does work. You taught me that, Margaret. You taught all of us. You did not give up on us when you had every reason to." "We will not give up on peace," she smiled at him. "When did you get so wise?" "I learned from the best," he said. The morning of the signing ceremony dawned clear and cold with frost sparkling on every surface like scattered diamonds. Margaret woke early and dressed carefully in the simple blue dress she had worn to her son's funeral, because it felt appropriate to honor his memory on this day. She pinned Peter's military medals to her chest and put on the crystal pendant the Apaches had given her. Around her, the meadow buzzed with activity as final preparations were completed. Thousands of people, both human and Apache, filled the seating areas. News drones circled overhead. Security forces maintained careful watch from every angle. The ceremony was set to begin at noon. Margaret stood backstage with Ambassador Cole and Commander Swift River and Flying Hawk. She was shaking slightly, and Flying Hawk noticed. He reached out and gently took her hand in his three-fingered grip. "You will be fine," he said softly. "You are the bravest person I know." "I am not brave," she protested. "I am just an old woman who made a choice. That is what bravery is," Swift River said through her translator. "Making the right choice when it is difficult. You have changed the course of history, Margaret Flynn. Today we honor that." The ceremony began with music from both cultures played simultaneously by a mixed orchestra. The sounds blended in unexpected ways, creating something entirely new. Human and Apache leaders took turns speaking about the Long War and the cost it had taken on both peoples. They spoke of the future they hoped to build together. They spoke of Margaret and the 20 soldiers and one winter night that changed everything. Then it was Margaret's turn. She walked onto the stage and looked out at the sea of faces, both human and alien. For a moment she was frozen with terror. Then she saw the 20 soldiers she had saved sitting together in the front row. They all stood when she appeared and placed their hands over their hearts in the Apache gesture of respect. That gave her courage. She stepped up to the microphone and began to speak. "I am not a politician or a soldier or a diplomat," she said. "I am a widow and a mother and a doctor. I have lived through great loss. My husband died too young. My son died in this war fighting against the people who now call me sacred. For 3 years I carried anger and grief everywhere I went. It was heavy and it poisoned everything good in my life." She paused and looked at Flying Hawk, who nodded encouragement. "Then one night during a terrible storm, 20 Apache soldiers came to my door. They were dying. They were the enemy. I should have hated them. Part of me did hate them, but I could not let them die. Something in me would not allow it. So I brought them inside and I saved their lives. I did not do it because I am special or heroic. I did it because it was the only choice I could live with." The audience was completely silent, listening to every word. "That night I learned something important," Margaret continued. "I learned that enemies are just people we have not understood yet. Those soldiers were young and scared and far from home. They had families who loved them and dreams they wanted to fulfill. They were not monsters. They were not evil. They were just on the other side of a war that neither side really wanted anymore. When I saw that I could not hold on to my hatred, it just fell away and left room for something better." She gestured toward the treaty document waiting on the table behind her. "This treaty is not just words on paper," she said. "It is a promise. A promise that we will choose understanding over fear, that we will choose life over death, that we will choose to see each other as we really are. Complicated, flawed, trying our best in a difficult universe. I cannot promise you this will be easy. Peace never is. There will be setbacks and misunderstandings and moments when we want to give up, but we cannot give up. Too many have died already. We owe it to them and to ourselves to make this work. She looked directly at the cameras broadcasting to billions of viewers. To the humans watching, I say this. The Apaches are not what we thought they were. They value honor and family and mercy. They grieve their dead and protect their sacred things. They are capable of forgiveness and change. Give them a chance. Let go of your anger and see what is possible. To the Apaches, I say the same. Humans are not monsters. We are messy and emotional and sometimes foolish, but we are also capable of great kindness and courage. We want peace as much as you do. Meet us halfway. Margaret stepped back from the microphone. Ambassador Cole and Commander Swift River came forward. They stood on opposite sides of the treaty document. Together they lifted ceremonial pens, one human-made and one Apache-made. They signed their names in their respective languages while cameras captured every moment. The crowd erupted in applause, and the sound of it was deafening. Humans and Apaches cheered together. Some people were crying. Margaret saw Commander Morrison wiping her eyes. She saw the 20 soldiers she had saved embracing each other. Flying Hawk came to her side as dignitaries from both governments added their signatures. "You did it," he said. "You actually did it. We did it," she corrected. All of us together. The celebration lasted hours. There were speeches and performances and shared meals. Margaret shook hands with presidents and prime ministers and Apache high counselors. Everyone wanted to meet her and thank her. It was exhausting, but also wonderful. She saw humans and Apaches talking and laughing together. She saw children from both species playing games. She saw the beginning of something that might last. As evening fell and the crowds began to thin, Margaret finally had a moment to herself. She walked away from the celebration back to her cabin. She stood on the porch where she had first found 20 dying soldiers and looked up at the stars. Somewhere up there, Peter was buried on Titan. Somewhere up there, countless others had died in the war. She hoped somehow they knew it was over. She hoped they could rest now. Flying Hawk found her there as she knew he would. He had become like a second son to her over these months. "You are thinking of Peter," he said. It was not a question, yes, she admitted. "I wonder what he would think of all this." "I think he would be proud," Flying Hawk said. "You turned his death into something meaningful. You made sure others will not have to die as he did." "That is a great gift, I hope so," Margaret said. "I really hope so." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade from the sky. Behind them, the celebration continued, but here it was quiet and peaceful. Margaret felt something she had not felt in years. She felt like she had come home to herself. The grief was still there. It would always be there. But it no longer consumed her. It had transformed into something else. Purpose, connection, hope. The following months proved that the peace was fragile but real. There were incidents and problems as expected. Some military units on both sides refused to stand down and had to be dealt with. Some colonies rejected the treaty and declared themselves independent. Extremists from both species carried out attacks trying to restart the war. But the peace held because too many people wanted it to hold. The majority on both sides were tired of fighting. They wanted to build something new. Margaret became an ambassador of sorts, though she had no official title. She traveled to human worlds and Apache colonies speaking about her experience. She met with veterans from both sides and helped them process their trauma. She worked with schools developing programs to teach human and Apache children about each other. She wrote a book about the night of the storm and everything that followed. The royalties went to funds supporting war orphans from both species. Flying Hawk stayed with her through it all. He became an official liaison between the two governments and split his time between Earth and Apache space. But he always came back to the cabin in Colorado, which had become a place of pilgrimage for people from both species. They came to see where it started. They came to meet Margaret. They came to believe that peace was possible. 5 years after the signing ceremony, Margaret stood in the same meadow for a different event. They were breaking ground on a permanent peace center, a place where humans and Apaches could meet and learn and work together. The building would house a museum documenting the war and the peace. It would have conference rooms and living quarters and a library filled with works from both cultures. At the center would be a garden planted with species from both Earth and the Apache homeworld. Margaret put the first shovel in the ground while thousands watched. She was 67 now and her hair was completely white, but her eyes were bright and her hands were steady. Flying Hawk stood beside her, and when she handed him the shovel, he took his turn. Then Swift River, who was now the Apache Minister of Human Relations. Then Henry Cole, who had retired as ambassador but remained involved in peace work. Then the 20 soldiers she had saved, now officers and leaders in their own right. One by one, they took their turns breaking ground on something new. That evening, Margaret sat on her porch with Flying Hawk and watched the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. "I am tired," she admitted, "but it is a good tired." "You have earned your rest," Flying Hawk said. "You have done more than anyone could ask." "There is still so much work to do," Margaret said. "So many people who need help. So many wounds that need healing. And there are many people doing that work now," Flying Hawk reminded her. "You started something that has grown beyond you. It will continue whether you are here or not. That is your legacy. You planted seeds that will grow for generations." Margaret smiled and touched the crystal pendant she still wore.